Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the Silicon Valley Leaders Symposium. And today, we're happy to be hosting Mr. Prakash Janakiraman. He's co-founder and chief architect at Nextdoor. Mr. Janakiraman is originally from Hayward, California, and he's an alumnus of UC Berkeley. He began his career as a software engineer at Excite at Home in 1996, before moving into engineering management at Shopping.com and ePinions in 2002. In 2005, Mr. Janakiraman began a 3-year stint at Google, where he managed engineering teams for Google Maps, Google Base, and Frugal. He co-founded Nextdoor.com, which many of you may be familiar with, in 2010, and it has grown in the last 8 years to be used by nearly 90% of neighborhoods across the United States and more than 3,000 public agencies. So once again, please help me welcome Mr. Prakash Janakiraman, co-founder and chief architect at Nextdoor.
Sorry, I forgot to put on my mic. Okay, can you guys hear me? Is that working out in the back?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me today. It is a pleasure always to come down to San Jose and be here in the heart of Silicon Valley and see the next generation of computer scientists and leaders here, so thank you so much. My name is Prakash. I am one of the co-founders of Nextdoor. Just a quick show of hands, how many people know what Nextdoor is? Oh geez, wow. That is awesome. I was not expecting that many hands. That is really, it warms my heart. Thank you so much. So quickly, just a little bit about me. That is me probably when I was a lot younger than probably a lot of you, but I think I was 12 years old in this picture. And what's interesting about that version of me is that about the age of 12 is when I learned how to program computers. And it was interesting because my dad, who also went to Cal like I did, was actually a CFO. He was a finance guy, originally a mechanical engineer, but he kind of was a home tinkerer. He really enjoyed kind of playing around on computers. And so he noticed that I was interested in things, like a lot of young boys back then, like video games. And he said, hey, maybe I could teach you how to program a little bit. And so I got a pretty early start on programming when I was about 12 years old. Now, growing up in Hayward, we didn't have computer science programs at our school. We didn't even have computers at Hayward High School where I went to school. So this was really all about kind of hobbyist learning at home. And so I was really grateful that my dad had the opportunity to introduce me to what eventually became my profession. Moved on, went to Cal. I dropped out of Cal my senior year to go work at a company called Excite, which I'm sure nobody remembers. Maybe only the more old people in the room. But Excite, if you think about what was happening back in 1996, which is when I wrapped up at Cal, was really the first wave of consumer internet companies. And so it's hard to think about a time when we didn't have the internet as a mass resource for everything that we use it for today, for information, for commerce, for social networking. None of those things were really at the forefront back then. So this was a really interesting wave in industry that was happening. But back at Cal, we weren't really learning about that. We didn't have access to the resources to learn about how to do web development or to build web applications. And I got a little taste of that by taking an internship at Excite, a company that I just happened to hear about through an ad in the classified listings in a newspaper. How many people actually subscribe to or read a newspaper today? Okay, a small set of folks concentrated mostly in the front. So it's kind of a sign of the times that we don't read newspapers anymore. We certainly don't look at classified ads in the newspaper. That's not a place that we look for jobs. But that's kind of how I got my start. Excite eventually was acquired for $6.5 billion. $6.5 billion in 1996 was one of the largest acquisitions at that point in the history of the internet. So it was a really incredible ride to start out at that company, which at the time when I started was 100 people. I was 21 years old. I had no idea how anything worked in business or in computer science. All I had been doing was like banging away in the lab and building little toy programs. I think I built a remote control in one of my classes, which was pretty cool. But really, that was the foundational experience that helped me understand consumer internet was interesting and was growing. At the time, I think we thought the total addressable market of people on the web was something like 50 million people. If you compare that to where things are today, we're talking about 2.5 billion people who use Facebook, 2.5 billion people who use Google. So 50 million people is where we thought that our total addressable market was back then. It's pretty incredible. I moved on to work at a company called ePinions, where I ultimately met my co-founders for our current venture, Nextdoor. ePinions was acquired by another company in New York. We merged to become a company called Shopping.com that went public in the fall of 2004. I think it was the third largest IPO of that year. Again, a really interesting experience for me to reinforce that consumer internet, building products at mass scale for a mass market, was really my passion. It was something that I really wanted to continue doing. And so no better place to do that than, of course, at the big G, at Google. And so when I joined Google, it was about 1,000 employees. It was the summer of 2005. I think Google is up to something like 50,000 plus employees now. Maybe it's even more than that, actually, right? It's probably even more than that. So it was the biggest company that I'd ever worked for at that point. And I had the honor and privilege of working on the Google Maps team, which at the time was just a little skunkworks project inside of Google. I think there were 14 people total working on it. Today, I think there's like 1,000 people globally working on it. And a really formative time of development where we built a product that ultimately was deeply useful to people all over the world. So lots of interesting experience, but the theme here all started from some early experience in programming, which ultimately became an interest in computer science, which ultimately became a career in building applications at scale for mass markets. So the first company that I started with two of my co-founders, Sarah Leary and Nirav Tolia, who I both worked with at ePinions, was a company called Fanbase. Quick show of hands, has anybody heard of Fanbase? Really? Okay. Fanbase ultimately was what I would think of today as a passion project. So I was inside of Google. I wasn't really thinking about doing something new, but my two co-founders said, hey, I think it's time to maybe go start a company. What do you think? I said, yeah, sounds interesting. What kinds of things might we want to change in the world? What kinds of opportunities are there in the world? They said, well, there's some opportunities around X, Y, and Z, a bunch of different ideas. But ultimately, the thing that sucked us in was all of our shared passion for sports. And so we decided to set forth on a journey to build what we thought could be a competitive product to ESPN, a community-generated almanac of all of the world's sports information. So if you were a Division III lacrosse player from Trinity College, you would have a page on this service that commemorated all of your athletic achievements in the same way that Michael Jordan or LeBron James would have a page on this service. So it created a common footprint, or a common platform for everybody at all levels who had ever participated in sports to commemorate their athletic achievements. And we thought this would be an interesting opportunity because, number one, people do search for themselves on Google. It's what we call vanity searches. And there's a huge amount of white space there and a huge amount of opportunity. If you ever search for your own name on Google, you might find some scary stuff, like your address and phone number and things like that. But imagine if you could find some old footage of you playing sports in high school or in college. The nostalgia of that. So we thought there was an opportunity here, and maybe to pair that with a business model around, selling merchandise. Thought it could be a good idea. So we launched it, but quickly we learned some lessons. And really the talk today is about the lessons in entrepreneurship. I think if I look around in the room, it's inevitable that some of you will come away in a few years and probably try and start a company of your own. And so hopefully some of these lessons will come back in your mind to help you as you think about how to frame starting a company and how to tactically get started. So we learned a few things. Number one, ultimately people didn't really care that much about their participation in college athletics or high school athletics. Certainly not later into their life, and certainly not enough to make it some sort of a necessity in the world. At best, it was a nice to have. Number two, it took us a really long time to build this product. It took us about a year, and we had all of this paranoia that somebody else was going to steal our idea, so we kept it to ourselves. We kind of closed ranks. We built it in a lab. We didn't tell anybody about what we were building, so we got no market feedback. which is really, really silly. I think if you think about it, the activation energy that is required for you to get up and start a company is in and of itself enough to get most people to not do it. It's not really about the idea, it's about that activation energy of taking the step forward and saying, you know what, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go incorporate a company. I'm going to get people together. I'm going to convince them to quit their jobs in pursuit of a higher mission. I'm going to go raise money. So there's all this friction beyond just having a good idea. But we were pretty paranoid that somebody was going to steal our idea, so no market feedback. We completely missed product market fit. We thought that there would be a market for this. We thought that people, we talked to a lot of smart people. We talked to Reid Hoffman, who was the founder of LinkedIn. We were able to raise $5 million in a Series A round on a PowerPoint deck about this. So it's not like we were talking to people who had no idea about what it takes to create a great business. They just didn't have much of an idea of what the product market fit could be. So they were taking a leap of faith, as we were. But we didn't do enough to substantiate that there was product market fit to begin with. Again, because we were not going out to get market feedback. And lastly, all entrepreneurs are optimists. You have to be. Because if you think about the odds are 90% against you, right? You're going to fail. 9 times out of 10, if you start a company, you will fail in some regard. And so you've got to be an optimist. You've got to believe that you're in that 10% that's somehow going to break loose. So these were some of the lessons that we learned from working on Fanbase for about a year and a half, from 2008 through the end of 2009, January of 2008, all the way through the end of 2009. So coming back from the Christmas break, we knew that there was something wrong. We knew that things weren't working well and that we needed to pivot to another idea. How many folks have heard of the word pivot in the context of companies? Okay, so mostly when you talk about a pivot, you're really talking about, okay, you're walking in this direction, and now we're going to slide over 10 to 15 degrees to the left or right, and we're going to walk in a slightly different direction. So that would lead one to expect that if you started a company in sports, maybe you didn't get the right idea in sports, but you're going to stay in sports and kind of move this way or that way. That's not exactly what we did. We actually just wholesale gave up on sports. So we, at this point, had raised 2 rounds of financing. So we'd raised $12.5 million. So again, smart people, some of the best investors in Silicon Valley, thought that this was a good idea. Thought this was the team that was going to bring this idea to fruition, and invested a fair amount of money in an unproven concept, $12.5 million. At this point, when we saw that our metrics were flattening, that engagement was really, really low, that people weren't really that interested in what we had built, it was heartbreaking. We had hired 14 people, right? Or our team was 14 at this point. Now think about that. We'd gone out and told people to quit their jobs, their high-paying jobs at great companies, to come work with us because we thought that this was going to be successful, and ultimately it wasn't. So we went back to our team and we said, hey guys, doesn't look like the sports idea is working, and it also doesn't look like we're going to continue to work in sports. We went back to our investors and we said, hey guys, we know that you gave us a bunch of money. We're not feeling great about this idea, and we don't know if this has legs, and we don't know if we can pivot into something else, if we can leverage the asset that we built in some other way. We'd like to give the money back. And our investors, to their great credit, said, how about you take this summer and think about some new ideas. Keep the money. Go back, talk to your team, see who's in for another round, who wants to try it again, see how the sausage is made from the ground up. And so we went back to our team and we said, hey guys, doesn't look like sports is going to be a thing. We know that some of you joined because sports is your passion. It just doesn't look like we're going to make it. For those of you who'd like to leave, we understand. We'll part ways as friends and we'll pay you 2 months severance, which is totally crazy. A failing company saying, we'll part ways as friends and we'll pay you on the way out, something that you don't see a lot of. And so ultimately half the team left. With the remaining 7 folks, we started to bat around a bunch of ideas that ultimately became the idea of Nextdoor. And our approach was entirely different. We were very reflective about the things that we had done wrong with Fanbase and the ways that we needed to adapt that with Nextdoor. So the first was, we talked about how Fanbase really wasn't an essential need. wasn't something that if we turned the lights out on, people would scream and be upset about it. So we wanted to find a product that had real need. We'll talk more about that in a second. We knew that member feedback was going to be really, really important. We wanted to get member feedback as cheaply as we could without spending a year and a half in development before finding out that something didn't work. So member feedback really early. We wanted to prototype something quickly. At Fanbase, we had so much conviction around our mission and our vision that we wanted to build it in completely full fidelity. We wanted to build the thing that was in our head as cleanly and beautifully and as perfect as we possibly could, so that we went out into the market with something that we could be proud of. Instead, with Nextdoor, we said, you know what, we got to get a prototype out as quickly as possible, get people using it so that we can get that market feedback and validate it in the market. And then we wanted to be brutally honest about what we were seeing, both qualitatively in talking to our customers and quantitatively in analyzing the metrics around the company. And so you can see this is a fundamentally different approach to company building. Had we been right and our vision had been strong, one might argue, okay, you came out, you built a product according to your vision, you built it at very high quality and very high fidelity. It took you a little longer than you would have liked, but ultimately you're okay, no big deal. But the problem is, let's go back to those statistics. 90% of startups fail. So do you want to wait a year and a half to figure out if you're in the 90% or the 10%? Probably not. Probably want to fail faster so that you get another swing at it. And so another way to think about this in terms of the contrast of Fanbase versus Nextdoor is we think of Fanbase as a vitamin, right? What characterizes a vitamin? Well, it's good for you. You should take a vitamin every day. If you miss a day, not that big a deal. If you miss a week, not that big a deal. If you never take a vitamin, not that big a deal. But a painkiller, if your head is throbbing and you're in a bunch of pain, you're going to run to the medicine cabinet and grab a Tylenol. And so we wanted to build a product that was much more the painkiller and much less the vitamin. And so the first part of the journey is identifying a real need in the world. Trying to figure out what gaps there are in the world and how potentially we can leverage technology, which is our skill set, to solve those problems. You kind of see the drug metaphor here. And it just so happened, the summer of 2010, while we were going through the pivot, we happened to read a New York Times op-ed about the decline in community in the United States. And this particular statement just jumped off the page to us. 29% of Americans know only a few of their neighbors, while 28% of Americans don't know a single neighbor by name. How many folks here in the room would characterize themselves as knowing a few of their neighbors? Anybody not know a single neighbor by name? So a few of you. It turns out that this is part of a broader decline in community over the past 70 years in the United States. We've become more mobile, so we move around more. We've become more busy. Our jobs are all consuming. Cost of living is high. And we've become more distracted by technology. So there's a lot of reasons that kind of sum up to this particular state. But we saw a problem in the world. Our communities are in decline. A real problem. And so the first thing that we did was we said, okay, we're not going to write a line of code. We're not going to build a product. We're going to do some lightweight surveying of everybody we can find to figure out if this is a problem that they sort of relate to, a problem where we can make a difference in their lives. And so we used a tool called SurveyMonkey. SurveyMonkey is a lightweight surveying tool. And we asked people, would you like to be more aware of issues and news in your neighborhood? Sent this out to a few hundred people. You can see that 212 folks answered. And overwhelmingly, people said yes. It's a pretty strong signal. So now we're starting to get somewhere. And we asked, how do you learn about issues in your neighborhood today? You can see the results. Mostly word of mouth from neighbors. So could we do something with technology to amplify that word of mouth? Potentially. Local newspapers, We just saw that nobody reads those anymore. And so there's a gap in terms of people's information exchange. Local government, neighborhood organizations, and so you can see that there's a variety of ways that people were getting information. But there were some trends that we noticed, like, for example, the decline in the popularity of local newspapers. That opened up an opportunity for us. And lastly, this is where we started to get a lot of conviction around what to go build. What are the problems we need to solve in this world? What is your interest in the following types of information in your neighborhood? You can see here, crime information is something that a large percentage of our respondents said they were very interested in. But also, if you look at private communication, news from my neighborhood, emergency alerts, real estate, etc., a lot of different use cases. And for those of you who have used Nextdoor, you'll notice that those are actually core use cases in the product. This was the key insight that drove it. So the big lesson here is you don't have to build a product in order to get feedback about whether a product you potentially could build is going to be useful. Sometimes you can do things as easy as sending out a survey. The other thing that we learned in terms of validating that there was a real issue in the world, a real problem to be solved, we read a book called Bowling Alone. It was written by a Harvard professor named Dr. Robert Putnam. He was the head of the sociology department at Harvard. And the book describes this gradual decline in community over the past 70, 80 years. Now, I'm not sure that I would recommend reading the book cover to cover. It is written as if it was written by a sociology professor at Harvard, so it's not exactly like light reading. But that being said, there's a few things that were important. Number one, Dr. Putnam talks about the importance of social capital and social reciprocity. Social capital is the equity that you have in the relationships in your community. Social reciprocity is the ability for you to ask your neighbors for help and for them to ask you for help in return. In areas where social capital and social reciprocity are both high, outcomes across the board, unsurprisingly, are much better. Whether it's affluence, crime and safety rates being lower, health outcomes being better, education outcomes being better, everything gets better when you know your neighbors. That was kind of the summary of the book. And so this statement, social networks in a neighborhood lower crime, improve public health, and raise test scores. Well, when he says social networks, he's not talking about Facebook or LinkedIn. This book was written long before those products existed. He's talking about the original social networks. People interacting with people, live, in person, in the real world. Imagine that, right? And so for us, this statement jumped off the page. And we said, you know what? I think we know what we got to go build. I think we've got an idea. So very powerful that the inspiration came from, number one, that New York Times op-ed, but also that there was available data to reinforce that we were on the right path. This is before we had built anything at all. Not a thing. The next big lesson is you want to get feedback early and often. By the way, one other thing to mention here, we haven't spent a dime at this point. We haven't made any significant investment outside of our own salaries, which is just carryover from fan base. We hadn't spent $1 on any of this stuff. So really, really cheap. The next lesson is to get feedback early and often. This is actually the original wireframe that we put together for the first version of Nextdoor. This is the real thing. I think this was done in July or June of 2010. And the idea was to give us a very lightweight frame of reference, visually, as to what we were going to go build. And so you can kind of see, we thought about a neighborhood kind of view with a map and a news feed, some statistics, some issues potentially. We had different constituents on the platform, including things like organizations and businesses and governments. We had some polls and voting, a homepage. Again, we hadn't really built anything yet, but we were just sort of spitballing. What are the possibilities? And giving it a little bit more structure. And so these wireframes, or kind of light mock-ups, gave us some framing of what we could go build. And then we iterated on that and we built a design. And this design is completely static. Again, done in Photoshop, or I don't remember what tool we used back then, but this was not a live prototype. But we wanted to give it some, some heft, like put a little meat on the bone and see what it might look like. And it's really, really fast to be able to prototype in this way and then try a bunch of different versions of the prototype. So we probably did dozens of different versions of the prototype. Said, okay, well, what if we change the way that user profiles look? What if we change the position of the map? What if we change the organization of the feed? The other thing is that we stole pretty liberally. Right? We knew that there was a product out there that millions and millions of people were using called Facebook. And so we, as you can see, the news feed, I don't know if people remember what the news feed at Facebook looked like in 2010, but it kind of looked like that. In fact, I think it looked exactly like that. And so I think sometimes it's okay to borrow great ideas, right? It's okay to steal great ideas. We knew that there was an interaction and a user interface that people would be used to, and so we borrowed pretty heavily from that. But the key here was, again, very low level of investment. And as you think about, as an entrepreneur, what kinds of products are good for startups to build, this is a little bit of a way to think about it. You think about this idea of the minimum viable product. It's kind of startup jargon for something that you can build in a reasonable amount of time, at a reasonable level of fidelity, to validate a hypothesis that you may have. And so, if you go too far on the minimum side, you're going to build something really crappy and nobody's going to want to use it. So you can't drift too far this way. If you build something that's overly viable, so you build it at full fidelity, and you build it in a way that's super complex and requires a lot of maintenance costs, there's products that are going to be built by companies much larger than you, with a lot more resources than you have. They're just going to come out and crush you. And you're going to get crushed under the weight of the complexity of what you're building. And so, good products for startups to build sit at the intersection between something minimum and something viable. Lesson 3, now it's time to move into a prototype. So here we are, we've got these lightweight mock-ups. We're starting to kind of coalesce around what we think the idea is. We've got a lot of market feedback from our members through the surveys, and we have a substantial hypothesis based on research and evidence that we built. So now it's time to go out and try and build something and put it into real people's hands. The intersection that you see here, by the way, is right down in Menlo Park. It's a neighborhood called Lorelei. Very well-bounded, 80 household or 90 household neighborhood. It turned out that one of my best friends was the HOA president in this particular, homeowners association president in this particular community. And so we had a little bit of a captive audience to go pitch this to. This is a quote by Reid Hoffman, who's the founder of LinkedIn, super smart guy, probably one of the most strategic thinkers in the Valley. If you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've probably launched too late. It's a way of saying, don't be afraid to put something out that's not quite perfect. Don't be afraid to put something out that hangs together but isn't quite as beautiful as you could make it. It's really about getting feedback. Minimum viable. And so this was the first version ever of Nextdoor. It wasn't even called Nextdoor at the time. We didn't even have the domain. We didn't have an idea that this was going to be something that we were going to work on for years and years and years, because we didn't know if it was going to work. And so we slapped it together. We called it Lorelei Neighbors. There's that familiar news feed. Looks just like Facebook. There's the map. And those are the two neighbors that we pitched to originally down in Lorelei. There's a sign now at the entrance to their community that identifies them as America's very first Nextdoor neighborhood. It's pretty cool. It's very, very cool. That's Salim and Heather, who are our very first founding members. And so we went to them, and my co-founder, Sarah, actually went and sat on a neighbor's couch, brought in like a laptop and a giant monitor, and said, hey, we want to pitch you on our idea. And of course they were skeptical. They're like, well, wait a minute, what is your idea, and who's building this, and wait, we're the first customers? What if you guys don't like it? And Sarah said, or I think they said, what if we like it, but you don't like it, and you decide not to continue working on it? And Sarah looked him straight in the face and said, I'm pretty sure that if you like it, we're going to like it. deal was done. We had our first neighborhood. And so next, it was all about validating in that market. So now we've got a customer. We've got a product in their hands. We're feeling pretty good. And we're super motivated because now you're getting this direct line of feedback, which is really, really awesome. In most cases, at scale as a company, now we have millions and millions and millions of users. It gets harder and harder to kind of zero in on just having a conversation on a couch with a group of people in a community. It just gets harder to kind of operationally do that. This is a quote from Mark Andreessen. Mark Andreessen is the inventor of the web browser. And he's a venture capitalist now, another super smart guy. And he says product market fit means being in a good market, and talk about what that means, with a product that can satisfy that market. So we felt pretty good about the fact that we were in a good market. What defines a good market? Well, if you're trying to build something big, it's your total addressable market. And so what's the total addressable market for a product like Nextdoor? Total addressable market is everybody that lives in a community anywhere in the world. It's pretty big. It's like about billions of people potentially. So we thought that we were in a good market. Did we think our product could satisfy that market? We hope so. So this kind of hung for us. Gave us a little bit of extra oomph. And so we spent an entire year trying to find that product market fit. Obviously, we started here in the Bay Area, where all of our friends and family were. And so we were dialing for dollars. Mom, Dad, you got to start one in your neighborhood. Called my sister. You got to start one in your neighborhood. Called friends. My co-founder Sarah spent some time up in Washington working for Microsoft. Called all of her friends. Called all of her friends in Boston. My co-founder Nirav grew up in Texas. Called all of his folks in Texas. So we were all over the place, dialing for dollars, begging people to use this product. And then they would say, like, oh yeah, we'll use it. And we go, oh shoot, they said they would use it. Oh, what do we got to do? Oh, we got to go get data about like Odessa, Texas, and Seattle, Washington. So we would go scramble and go to the county office and like get a CD of all of the housing units in that area and import the data or trace it. And we were doing all kinds of crazy things just to get this thing up and running because we didn't want to overbuild. So we were doing things just to get the product up and running for people, collecting feedback. And ultimately, at the end of that year, this was October of 2011, we finally felt like we had 176 neighborhoods all across the country. We had diverse neighborhoods, so rural, urban, suburban, large neighborhoods, small neighborhoods. We felt like we were getting enough feedback that we could actually launch something to market. And all of those unscalable things that we were doing, we had productized. We had invested time to say, okay, we just did this for 10 different neighborhoods. That probably means that we're going to do it for the next 1,000. Let's make sure that we go automate some of that. Let's get some leverage out of this. So those were the lessons that we learned in this beta period before anybody publicly knew what we were doing. We hadn't done any marketing. We hadn't done any press. So ultimately, when the time came to do a little press and make a little splash about it, it was pretty well received. We were in the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, Fast Company. I think we were in the New York Times. And ultimately, we got a bunch of data and a bunch of feedback. Some of the data was good, like the number of visitors that were coming to the site, the number of neighborhoods that were coming in. Some of the data was not as good. We weren't growing that fast because ultimately it comes back to that original statistic. 29% of Americans knew very few of their neighbors. 28% didn't know a single neighbor by name. Guess what that means? They don't have electronic correspondence with them, so they can't send them an email inviting them to join the service. They can't dump out their contact list on their phone. They can't connect to them on Facebook. So really, this thing was growing by word of mouth slowly. It was one of the big challenges. And so that leads us to think about, how do you grow a product like this? How do you grow it into something that could potentially have millions and millions and millions of users? It's really hard. You got to do unscalable things. In the early days of a startup, I would say this is probably one of the most important lessons that we can share, which is everybody's on a rush, in this big rush to get big fast. And there's a kind of hesitation to get your hands super dirty. Because you're like, well, you know what? We really should automate that. Or how is this going to work when we have 1 million users? We can't do this. It's going to take forever. It's going to be too expensive. But you kind of have to figure out, you have to build pattern recognition of what those things are by first doing them manually before you go in and try and automate them and try and build a process to do things at scale. So a couple examples. I talked about Sarah going out and sitting on people's couches and literally pitching them and like dragging this giant 25-inch monitor with her. That was personally recruiting new neighborhood members, getting on the phone, calling them, talking to them. We talked about drawing those neighborhood maps by hand, going to the county assessor's office and getting a CD and loading the CD in and then getting the stuff on the screen and tracing it and then importing it into Nextdoor. I mean, this stuff was really, really nasty. And it took us hours for every one of these neighborhoods, those 176 neighborhoods. Each one of them probably took, an hour or a couple of hours to do. And increasingly that kind of came down as we started to build systems around it. And the most important one was we had to create offline invitation mechanisms. People did not have electronic correspondence with their neighbors. So what does that mean? We actually send millions of dollars of postcards in the mail every year. Millions of dollars. If you had told me when we were starting this company that we would be one of the U.S. Postal Service's biggest customers, I would have told you we were crazy. But that's what we had to do, because how else could you invite neighbors with whom you had no other correspondence? You could go knock on their doors, but if you were doing that, then why would this product need to exist in the first place? You probably already knew your neighbors. Probably had the courage to do that, right? So a lot of these things kind of appeared to be unscalable. And I still remember we had a giant printer in our office where we were printing these postcards, and then like a stamping machine, and we'd run them all through the stamps. And then there'd be this giant stack of postcards that someone in the office would just like schlep down to the post office and like dump into a giant bin. And we did that for a while until those stacks got too big. And then we had to go find a postcard partner that could print them at much larger scale. So, these things were all unscalable. But ultimately were key components of our growth. You can see examples of some of these things. These are what the postcards look like. People putting up flyers in their community. Lawn signs, right? Just like an election or a campaign. And so these are all like offline invitation mechanisms. This is not something that the Googles of the world think about because they're at scale. They don't need to do these things, but we did. Another thing that we did that was really interesting was we started to think about other ways that we could connect organizations and communities. And one of the key organizations is trying to get governments involved and municipal agencies. So in this example, we've got the city of Oakland partnering with us to be able to push information out to their communities. Well, what does that do for us? Number one, provides interesting content on the platform, but number two, legitimizes our platform by aligning us to entities that local communities find important and legitimate. So whether that's a municipal office like the mayor's office, Department of Emergency Management, or police or fire departments, we found that these partnerships were natural and important in substantiating us as a real product and as a real company. So this is an example where we started to kind of invest in building credibility. And again, it wasn't scalable. We had to go out and shake hands and talk to these people and meet the police captain and convince them that this was an important thing to do. And over time, we started to develop a little bit more of a system and a process for getting them on board self-service. PR, we started to get a little bit of buzz, especially in local media. One of the interesting things with a product like Nextdoor is because you're in all of these different communities, and each of those communities ultimately has its own personality, its own issues, its own people, you can make heroes of the people who are using the platform to do good in their communities. And so we picked up on that pretty early. And again, it's not that scalable to begin with. You've got to go make phone calls. You've got to get an inbound stream of feedback. But if you can make your users heroes on the platform, it's huge. It's a huge asset for your product and for your company. This is what it looks like today. 90% of neighborhoods in the United States use Nextdoor. 92%, I guess. You can see it's everywhere, like all over the place. And you saw what that original map looked like. 7 years ago. 176 neighborhoods. It's now 183,000. We're probably doing somewhere around 100 neighborhoods a day. 90% of the neighborhoods in the top 25 cities are using Nextdoor. You can see San Jose right there. And it all started with this kernel of something that we didn't think we could scale. We weren't sure we could scale. But ultimately, you figure it out in smaller and kind of growing increments. It's become a lifeline to the neighborhood, so you can see all of these different ways that people are using the product. Everyday and useful things like meeting your neighbors, all the way to really critical things like neighborhood watch, urgent alerts, somewhere in between. You can organize block parties and events. Broad range of use cases as well. And this is something that we learned organically by evolving the product. We didn't have experiences for each of these different types of use cases when we started. All we had was that simple little news feed. What we started to identify was, oh geez, a lot of people are posting things for sale or giving things away. Oh man, there's a lot of people reporting burglaries and break-ins. And so we started to create specific experiences for these key use cases. You can see how those kind of shake out. And it works internationally. So we're now in 7 different countries. We might be in 8 now, actually, now that I think about it. So the Netherlands was in 2016. We're already in 86% of neighborhoods in the Netherlands. So that went a lot faster than the United States did. Obviously, it's a smaller country. They have a lot more community. 85% of the neighborhoods in the UK. And we're just getting started in Germany and France. So these things all kind of come together, right? You want to make sure that you found a product or a challenge in the world that's a painkiller and not a vitamin, something that the world really wants and needs. And there's something to be said about kind of the suite of products that people think about today. You know, you've got the painkillers and the vitamins, but you've also got some products that we would think of as drugs. You know, the Facebooks and Snapchats and Instagrams. I'm not poo-pooing these products. These are all great products, and they deliver a lot of value in the world. But there's something different about kind of the core of a product like this, which is really rooted in utility. If people aren't like pulling to refresh on our app all day, they're actually okay with that. If they come by and they find daily utility in it, they use it once a day, maybe they even use it once a week, that's great. They feel like it's critical for them to have the app and to use it as frequently as they want to, that's great. You know, that's in stark contrast to the drugs, right? To the Instagrams where you're like, did someone like my post? Oh, let me try again, let me try again, let me try again. Or the Snapchats, or the messaging apps. We don't feel like that's the kind of product that we need to be. We just want to deliver a lot of value to the people who are using the product. So that's all I got. I got some time for questions. There's a few resources on here for those of you who are interested in entrepreneurship. The Founder's Dilemma, which is a book by Noam Wasserman. 4 Steps to the Epiphany, Stephen Blank. The Lean Startup, which I think was a really, really, really influential book for us in starting Nextdoor. It describes the MVP framework, rapid iteration, making sure that you don't overbuild. And then there's a great book called Founders at Work, which is a series of interviews with a bunch of different founders of successful companies, describing their challenges and their paths. So it's almost like this talk in a book. And we found that really inspiring and interesting. So hopefully you found this useful. Thank you, guys.
All right, thanks, Prakash. I know we have time for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand.
Hello. If you open a Facebook page of your neighborhood, so what makes that different from what you have? What difference? What makes yours different from doing that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question was, what differentiates us from a Facebook page for a neighborhood group? Number one, again, going back to the statistics about how many neighbors people know, typically people don't know their neighbors. And we did some early research when we started the company because obviously we felt like Facebook or Google could be a competitive threat to us. And it turns out that there was a statistic posted that 2% of the average Facebook user's friends would be people that they would consider neighbors. And so the vectors for connectivity just aren't there. Secondly, if you think about Facebook's true north, it's really about connecting people who you really know in the real world, who you have real relationships with. And so ultimately that falls in conflict with interacting with strangers or people that you don't necessarily know. And so the context really matters. In the early days of LinkedIn, people often would challenge this in the same way, and they'd say like, well, Facebook has everybody on there. Why couldn't you just create like a professional kind of group for Facebook as well? And the context really matters, right? If you think about your interaction on Facebook, how the news feed plays out, what you're seeing in the news feed, and trying to interleave content from people who you either don't know or don't recognize, it's tough. It's tough. And I would think for Facebook, especially given their new focus, some of you may not have seen this, but Mark Zuckerberg wrote a 1,300-word memo about the importance of local communities. And a lot of that kind of intersects some of our mission. And so maybe potentially they might want to encroach on this space, but I think it's pretty challenging given the context of that platform and given the lack of trust, frankly, in that platform today. One of the things that we do on Nextdoor, which is a little bit different, and it's actually something that we talk about a lot as being foundationally important. Everybody who participates in Nextdoor is participating in a bounded neighborhood community. So all of our neighborhoods are geographically bounded, and they define the eligibility to participate in the neighborhood. But you have to verify that you actually live in the neighborhood before you can participate in there. The reason, again, is because most people don't know their neighbors. And so you need some assertion of trust that says, okay, I'm only interacting with people who live in my community. So that's another difference between us and Facebook in that way.
We've got questions on this side of the room. I'll give you the mic and I've got a person in the back.
Hi. So earlier you talked about how when you were constructing, when you were first constructing Nextdoor, you took a lot from the imagery or the structure of Facebook.
Yeah.
Did you guys run into any legal issues? And how would you navigate around if you are taking ideas from established companies? How would you go about kind of protecting yourself legally?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Were there any legal issues in, sort of taking gratuitous inspiration from another product? I think the answer is no. If we had encountered something, if Facebook had sent us a cease and desist or something like that, obviously we would have had to respond. But it's really not that uncommon. I think one of the things that's interesting about Silicon Valley is that it takes this evolutionary path. Rarely is there, generationally, there are true, absolute innovations, something that is groundbreaking and new. In most cases, it's much more evolutionary. And so I think if you think about all the products that have been built, Google wasn't the first search engine. Google didn't define the user interface for search results. Those have been around for decades, and they stole pretty liberally from the gold standards of those times, including the Excites of the world. So it is rare that a company goes after another company for copying the user interface in that way. It's more common that if they view a company as a competitive threat and they're stealing intellectual property, patents, things like that, that they would come after them.
Question in the back.
Hi, first of all, I want to thank you, and I relate this topic because I use Nextdoor, and it's very
Thank you.
and it's very important for my family, and also it's something that we all can see and how it got developed. My name is Carmen, and a group of ours are in the industrial systems engineer, and you were talking about it. It was just right on the systems engineer alley, like the way you mapped and think and process and look at the big things. So it just fascinated me a lot. So that was one thing. And the second is, it's just a simple question. When you had the demographics, you had some red spots, and I was wondering, what are those red spots? Yeah, yeah,
In here?
yeah, and or in all the maps.
Yeah, so there's actually a subtlety into the way that we start neighborhoods. The green neighborhoods are what we call launch neighborhoods. Those are neighborhoods that have 10 or more verified members. But ultimately, most neighborhoods start in what we call a pilot state. The pilot state is when a new member comes in, they enter their address, and a neighborhood has not yet been created for their community. And so they have the opportunity to define the neighborhood boundary and to invite the first 10 verified members. And so during that process, that's what's called a pilot. And so the orange color, the red color, are pilot neighborhoods that ultimately become part of the permanent canon when they tip over to 10 verified members. Yep.
I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
I remember there was a little bit of a controversy a few years ago because Nextdoor tended, especially in neighborhoods where you may not know all your neighbors, to be a vehicle for racial profiling.
Yep.
And I read a really great article about from Harvard Business Review, and it talked about how you your company came into action really quickly, and you were able to reduce the incidence by 75% or something like
Yeah,
that
that's
in
right.
a really short amount of time. But that's still 25% still remaining, right?
Yeah.
So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think reflecting on that experience, first that was feedback that came to us from the community. And ultimately I think there was some press around it or something also that kind of heightened the escalation. The first thing that we needed to do was better understand the problem. And so we went out and we partnered with a community organization in Oakland that was formed on Nextdoor actually called Neighbors for Racial Justice. And we had a sit-down meeting with them and we talked about what some of these experiences look like and what the conditions were that were leading to those experiences. We then partnered with the Oakland Board of Supervisors, an organization called the 100 Black Men in Oakland as well, as a Bay Area chapter. And we talked and we had these open dialogues about what we needed to do. And ultimately the decision was we needed to change the product. And so think about how few companies will take the leap of actually making changes to a product that is really predicated around the flow of content, right? So you're pushing content, which then leads to more engagement, which then leads to more content. What we ended up doing is we put friction into the process through which you posted an urgent alert or a crime and safety notice that said, hey, wait a minute, take a second, think about this a little bit longer. Are you describing a situation of concern, or are you describing somebody purely on the basis of their race? And so we actually slowed people down through the user interface to do that. Now that was one of what I think is going to be a suite of changes that ultimately are more broad than just racial profiling, but it's really about abuse, trolling, people not behaving in a civil way. So we think about it as incivility at large. But also there's fraud as well. You know, people trying to scam people by sending them offers for things that don't really exist. And so we have a lot of, this is one of the price of doing business in this kind of a business. You know, whether you're Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, is that you have to have a lot of resource behind trust and safety. And so that's something that I think is going to be an ongoing challenge for us.
Yeah, thanks for the answer. I know there were more questions on this side of the room.
I had a question, but that was pretty much my question. It was about hate and racial profiling. So you were one step ahead of me.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Hi, I use Nextdoor a lot to advertise programs for my nonprofit, so it's really cool to see how you developed from this product from the very beginning. I have two questions. The first one is, what kind of research or surveying did you do to figure out the UI, or did you just figure out that like Facebook's layout would be the best?
In the early days or on an ongoing basis? In the early days, it was pretty simple. We just said, we're just going to use something that people have already identified, so we didn't do much research at all. Today, we actually do have a UX researcher whose mission it is to kind of go out, survey users, understand what they find difficult about using the platform and what they find delightful about using the platform, and coalesce that into the right experience. Ironically, he worked at Facebook and at Google in the same role, so I think he's got a lot of specialized experience. His name is David Choi, and he's basically tasked with doing the qualitative research, which it comes in ebbs and fits for us. So as we're doing new product development, we try and get qualitative research and feedback. Even today, when we have 30 million users, trying to figure out, okay, are things working? What do you need? What's not as good? But in terms of just the pure UX, we tend to use another technique as well beyond the qualitative research, which is to do something called A/B testing. Are you guys familiar with that at all? It's the idea that you can have multiple versions of an interface and that you deliver that version, those different versions, to different cohorts of users, and then you play them off of one another in the metrics. And so sometimes we can get quantitative feedback about something being, especially for task-oriented flows, when you're trying to figure out, okay, is somebody figuring this out? The metrics usually jump out at you, so we use a few different techniques.
Okay. And my second question is, what are some threats you see for Nextdoor right now? Like you mentioned, Facebook encroaching on same interests.
I actually, more of what I worry about on a day-to-day basis, more than the competitive threats of somebody else coming into our space, is more about things like incivility. I think we have to figure out a way, and it's a little bit of a microcosm. I don't want to get into like a deep philosophical thing about this, but it's a microcosm of kind of state of the world right now, where trust is eroding, people are feeling angry, there's a lot of pent-up frustration. And if you think about this product, no matter what we build, ultimately the product takes on the identity of the community in which you landed.
Right.
So it's the people that are participating. If those people are angry and upset about their life circumstance, it's going to show up on the platform. And that ultimately will have a negative sentiment on other people who are coming in new, trying to use the platform. If they see people sniping at each other or angry with one another. So to me, if I were thinking of the more kind of existential threat, it's not that Facebook comes in and crushes us. It's not that Google comes in and crushes us. It's that all of a sudden the sentiment changes about whether this is actually as useful or as positive a product as it could be. So we spend a lot of time talking about this. In fact, next week in the office, we're hosting a professor at Berkeley. His name is Dr. Keltner. And Dr. Keltner's work was kind of central in helping Facebook understand empathy on their platform. So I don't know if you guys remember Facebook for a long time, they kind of just had the like button, and it was just a one action up or down. I guess it was only up. And now they've got a range of like little emotions in there. Dr. Keltner was the one that they partnered with to kind of understand how to do that. So we're actually working with him to understand how to make our product a little bit more civil and a little bit more positive. So that to me is the thing that I kind of think about a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Great. We have about 2 more questions, and then we're going to hand up here, and then we'll do one more. We gotta stop.
Thank you so much. So actually, my first experience using Nextdoor is when I was just in a new country, in a new neighborhood, didn't know anyone, and first-time driver, and battery of my car just died. I have to go for a meeting, and then I through Nextdoor find a neighbor who jump-started my car.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. That's incredible.
Yeah, so I'm a faculty from business college, so from a more entrepreneurship point of view, I really appreciate you sharing like at the early stage of the Nextdoor, like understanding user needs, low-fee prototyping, etc. The cost is minimal. That's what you said. And along the way, you also mentioned like dialing for people who potentially use it and physically use it, etc. And I'm assuming that along the way you will need some money going in. So
Yes.
I wonder, do you have any experience sharing whatever you learned about investments and sponsor your company, etc.?
So the question was really about investment. Obviously, in the early days, we tried not to spend any money, and now we're probably spending a lot of money. We've raised $275 million to power the company. So it is no longer that cheap to operate. We have a staff of 220 people. We have people all over the world. We also spend a lot of money on things like postcards, as I mentioned. The way that we think about that, especially now, in a world where we are able to actually earn revenue on the product by serving ads that are locally relevant, also inviting people like local real estate agents and other small to medium-sized businesses to participate on the platform. Ultimately, that'll be our revenue stream. But in the meantime, with a lot of consumer companies in particular, there's a little bit of a stage at which you start to earn revenue. And first, what you're trying to do is establish product market fit, grow your user base, and then grow usage of the product before you ultimately monetize. Because most of these services end up being ad supported. And so sometimes that takes a long time. In the case of a product like ours, that grows a little bit more slowly because of the inherent challenges and headwinds of people not knowing their neighbors. Well, it took us six or so years before we started earning revenue. And so in anticipation of that, we had to go raise a lot of money because we didn't want to necessarily pace the company's growth entirely to the rate at which we were earning revenue. And so that's a testament more to our investors and their belief that by investing $275 million, that they would ultimately make multiples of that, in return. So, did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
We have one last question. And hopefully our speaker will stick around if there's folks who want to come up and ask
Yeah.
questions. We've got a lot of folks, so.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and sharing this with us. So,
recording.
Oh, for the recording.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and sharing this with us. Very insightful. So my question, I guess, was you talked a lot about the lessons you've learned from fan base and like the reflective process. So I was wondering, like during the reflective process for Nextdoor, was there anything that you would have done differently or changed? Any challenges that you faced while you were building Nextdoor with you and your team?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Number one, at various times, we got lulled back into this idea that we needed to build something at full fidelity that we probably could have delivered in a much more raw way. So there were features that we developed that we didn't have a lot of confidence in. We didn't know for sure that they were going to work, but we probably spent a little bit too much time building them only to discover that they didn't work. So I think that's one thing. Number two is, I think we've learned a couple of lessons about building culture. And that's a whole different conversation about company culture. But Nextdoor is a very mission-driven company. You think about why people would come to work for Nextdoor as opposed to going to some other company. And these days you can go get a job. If you've got the skills, you can get a job anywhere. So why would you come to Nextdoor? It's largely because you want to spend your time, your 40 plus hours a week doing something that makes a difference in the world. And that attracts a certain type of individual, an individual that is intrinsically motivated, rabidly curious, resourceful, collaborative, good communicators, people who care about their communities. And so ultimately that's the way that we've shaped the company. And it doesn't take much to bring in somebody into the company that doesn't necessarily align to those values to disrupt it. It's like a pebble in the pond. If you throw a pebble into the pond, you see the little splash, but then there's ripples that keep going outwards. And it's really important to manage your culture in a way that is explicit. So defining what your true values are, defining what's important to you and being objective in those criteria, and then making sure that when people kind of run afoul of those values, that you course correct that really quickly, because otherwise the damage can be pretty lasting. And so I think that's another lesson that we've learned, a couple times in the course of the company. Largely it's not been a huge issue for us. We've done a good job of hiring, but sometimes you learn the hard way.
All right, let's thank our speaker again. For those of you who are keeping track at home of your Go Points, this is a Go Point opportunity. Just take a selfie of yourself somewhere in the room and upload it and you're good to go. And thank you very much, Prakash.
Thank you.